Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and this evening, as I was doing some work, in my normal communication with families in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, or just in discussions through social media as I'm posting during the day, there was an issue that's been in my mind that I'd like to talk about because I think that it may be a helpful discussion, especially in today's political climate, because there's an oversimplification of political views, of culture, of ideas about the Catholic faith. In my case, as I'm a Catholic, there's an oversimplification where everything seems to be divided into two options, and we have these terms, liberal and conservative, used to classify people. And I'd like to talk about this a little bit because I think that this is a system of classification that really isn't helpful. It's unfortunate that we've kind of fallen into this classification system, and what I find is that, especially among conservatives, I guess both sides are guilty of this, but I'm really more concerned with the conservatives who will quickly label someone a liberal as soon as they express an idea that doesn't fit the normal conservative Christian talking points in political conversation. The reason why I think that this is a problem is because the reality of the situation is more complicated than I think many of these so-called conservatives understand. I'm especially aware of this because I see people, Catholics, calling the bishops and the Pope liberal, as if that means that they share a certain view of morals, or that they're actually supportive of certain moral activities or ideas in our society. And I just don't think that this is accurate. And I think the use of these terms is very misleading. And I think that some people, because of this oversimplification, have sort of an exaggerated self-confidence in their moral position, when their moral position isn't necessarily the stronger moral position. And I'd like to talk a little bit from my own background and experience to kind of illustrate the point that I'd like to make. So the problem is that in modern circles, it appears, or there's an attempt to cause an appearance to exist that there's a war between two sides, the conservatives and the liberals. The liberals are thought to have their own, perspectives on morals and culture and things like that. Excuse me 1 minute. The morals of the liberals are understood to be a certain set of principles, like we've got, feminism, homosexuality, communism, all of these political left ideas that are rejected by those on the right. And then the conservative ideas are more like traditional family life, sexual morality, traditional sexual morality, male and female gender in light of all the transgender craziness. We understand what these two sides are, left and right. But the problem with this is that there are people who can distinguish between moral convictions and political policies, because these are not the same thing. There are also people who have moved from one side to the other in both directions, and they have different perspectives of the other side. And what this leads to is it leads to a lot more complex reality than this left versus right, liberal versus conservative worldview allows for. And it leads to a lot of really ignorant and unproductive discussion and interaction between not the two sides, but just between different Americans, different Christians who have different views, and they have different views for reasons. For example, I'm not a fan of the pro-life movement, and yet I'm 100% pro-life. As soon as I say that I'm not a fan of the pro-life movement, I'll be labeled as a liberal and accused of promoting abortion. And this is the kind of ignorant discussion that's common. When I say that I'm not a fan of the pro-life movement, what I mean is, while I am anti-abortion and pro-life, I don't think that the pro-life movement's activities and message, their policies they seek and so on, are the best possible policies or best solution for the problem. I think the problem is more complicated. I think that there needs to be phases or steps by which people are helped out of a abortion-friendly mindset where they're really insensitive to abortion, where they're helped step by step out of that thinking and into a better place. And I think it largely has to do with their being evangelized and introduced to the sacramental life and given access to the grace of the Christian life that will help them not only to think rightly, but also to act rightly. I don't think that politics is a solution. If politics was the solution, we wouldn't need the sacraments. We wouldn't need a church. We wouldn't need the gospel. Christ would not have had to come into the world. We wouldn't need the Holy Spirit. We would simply change the laws and sort of bring about all the goals of the kingdom of God, which is just false teaching and false practice. And so I oppose or don't support the pro-life movement very simply because I think it oversimplifies the reality of the problem and doesn't address it in a Christian way, in light of the gospel, in light of the church, in light of the sacraments, and so on. But if I express any lack of enthusiasm for the pro-life movement, I'll be immediately labeled a liberal, pro-abortion, lefty, liberal, and then, I mean, the language is foul and disrespectful and simply false. That's the problem with it. It's just false. Because these folks can't think outside of this two-category or two-class worldview that they've developed, and they're simply wrong. And this happens all the time. We'll see the same thing from, let's say, the Pope or bishops speaking. We'll find that they don't have this hard right-wing, moral message, or they won't agree with the political actions or political demands of these right-wing Christian people, and then they're automatically labeled liberals and leftists and all this, communists, pro-gay, all this stuff, just simply because they don't approve of everything that this far-right conservative American Christian political party or worldview demands and pursues. And it's simply false. Now, I'd like to share something of my own background to explain why I don't have the feelings or opinions of many of my fellow Christians or Catholics who are far-right conservatives in political and moral issues. I'd like to explain a little bit, because we all have our current life, and if you look at me, take a snapshot of me as a 47-year-old man with a large Christian family and all this, you can imagine, hey, there's a conservative, there's a right-wing guy, there's one of our fellow Republican, pro-life, whatever, and yeah, that's how things look at age 47 in my life. That's how things look if you take a snapshot right now. But I don't think like most right-wing conservative Christians, because I came from and came through liberal culture. I was in liberal culture. I was around homosexuals. I wasn't a homosexual, but I spent time talking to homosexuals. I had homosexual relatives. I know what they were like. I know what their problems were. I know how they lived. I know the details of how they lived. I've had intimate conversations with them. I've talked to atheists. I've sat in offices alone with atheist college professors talking about their religious beliefs and their experiences and so on. And I know why they have the convictions that they have. I've been in public schools and public universities. I attended a liberal university. I know what the professors are like. I know what they teach. I know what the culture is like. I know what the student body is like. I've been there. And I've been through it. And I've been through it, as an unbeliever myself, and have come out of it to become a believer. And so I have a little, I guess you could say, I'm more liberal with liberals, because I don't find liberal views or liberal criticisms to be intimidating or difficult to unravel and refute and explain. And it's my desire usually to try to help clarify things, not just label and dismiss them as if that's some kind of success. I was raised in the public school system. I wasn't well parented, wasn't supervised. I was left really to the streets to hang out with friends. My parents worked. Like I said, I wasn't supervised, and I was free to roam as a kid growing up. I was nothing like I am now, and there's no way that you can really imagine what I was like as a kid. But I was with all of the different kinds of people in society, people who use drugs, athletes, mechanics, burnouts, any type of people you could imagine. I was with them as a kid. I know their culture, I know their life, I know how they think, I know what they do, I know how they talk, I know the music they listen to, the shows they watch, the activities they participate in. I was there, I was in it. Went through high school, graduated high school, went to college, still as an unbeliever when I first went to college. Spent my freshman year just kind of feeling my way around, hung out in bars and clubs, went out with my friends, listened to, grunge rock music, drank a little bit. I was never too much into drinking, didn't do any drugs, but I was around it all. I would say that God protected me from a lot of things, but I was there. I was in the presence of it all, around it all, participating in, the culture for fun. I was a clown. I liked to goof around. I had great friends, kids that I was friends with from preschool and kindergarten that I went to school with my whole life and even hung out with in college. We had a good time. And I was with them all. And I know what they did. I know what their life was like. I was with them. I knew them personally. I had family members and relatives that were, all kinds of different people, mechanics. My uncles owned a junkyard. My father and uncles were in racing, so I was around the whole auto racing community. We had friends and relatives that were police officers. I was an athlete growing up, hung out with all the athletes, coaches, into all the different sporting events and things like that. I just experienced in God's providence almost every different class of people as I grew up, and I became comfortable with them. And when I was a freshman in college, I started to, even in high school, I had sort of private religious thoughts. And then I met my future wife when I was in high school, and she introduced me to evangelicalism. I started reading the Bible, which I was very interested in. Evangelicalism I was not interested in. But I was interested in the scriptures. I started to read the scriptures privately, but it was within my whole worldly life. I was still living a worldly life, but privately I was reading the scriptures and I was thinking. I was thinking about things. And then what changed my life, really once and for all, there was one night I was out at a club with my friends, and this was sort of like a rock club where we'd go out, drink a few beers, and then sort of mosh around, as local bands played and stuff like that. And there was also just like, all the popular rock and grunge music played in the club. But there was one night when I was there, and I was just goofing around as normal, but I had these thoughts in my head. And these thoughts in my head, I was thinking of the passage that I read in the scriptures that just took a hold of my thoughts, and it was the scene from the Gospels where Jesus talks about himself judging the world. And he says, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire." And those words were in my head as I was out at the club, goofing around with my friends, having a blast. No one knew it but me. And that night was the last night that I ever talked to them. That was it. That night I went home and I was converted. I never, and what's important to understand is that those friends that I had were kids that I was friends with from elementary school. They were kids that I played sports with. They were kids whose parents were friends with my parents, whose houses I slept over, who slept over my house. It was one night, one specific night, where thoughts of judgment just changed my life, and I never went back. And I sort of locked myself away and studied and devoted my life to Christ at that moment. But I was in the midst of college culture, and it was secular college life, secular campus life. I was in a liberal university, Rutgers University, and I was going through my conversion as I was in the midst of all that stuff. So I was studying the scriptures, growing in my faith, thinking, asking questions, and I had the opportunity to just have constant discussions with professors and fellow students. And I was very comfortable in that climate. I was one of them. I was a member of that culture who was in the process of becoming something else. But I was very comfortable in that culture, talking about things, discussing things. There were no issues that I was ignorant of or afraid to talk about. Like I said, I talked to there was an organization at Rutgers called Big LaRue, which was the bisexual, gay, and lesbians at Rutgers University. I used to talk to them about religion and stuff, have arguments with them. I talked to my professors, argued, any time that I had a question or they said something or I read something that I didn't agree with, I would talk about it with my professors. I just had a very comfortable, open conversion experience that really took place throughout the course of my college studies. And so I was very comfortable, very friendly with the kinds of people that are, criticized and attacked and labeled as liberals and leftists in these modern discussions. And so, as a Christian, one thing that I see in conservative Christian people, and they portray, they project, I should say, they project a sort of confidence and strength. But I see in their talk and in their arguments and in their behavior, I see ignorance and timidity. I see that they're actually afraid of engaging with other people because their arguments, they sort of live in an echo chamber where their arguments are always shared with people who agree with them. And when they do talk to people who don't agree with them, they usually just throw out some argument and then start calling names or throwing labels, or they just disappear, They don't actually lead people anywhere. They don't help people. They just sort of try to excuse themselves by throwing labels and proving themselves to be committed to their conservative position. And that's really not evangelization. And when they're challenged by an intelligent non-Catholic or an intelligent liberal, they don't have anything to say because they don't understand the things that the liberals are saying. And it's a shame that they don't listen because liberals are often pointing out flaws in their thinking and in their message that if they would listen and learn, they would become stronger and would actually have a better message and be able to live a better Christian life. But they don't listen. They're just eager to throw the labels, to throw the names, and sort of high-five their fellow conservatives as they ignore the things actually being said. And this is why we see the disrespect for Christianity among liberals, because it's not because they're all just crazy and they're all immoral. It's because many of them have tried to have intelligent discussions with Christians or with conservatives, and they've found that the Christians or the conservatives simply aren't sincere. They're not interested in these discussions. They're not really interested in the topics. Their answers are oversimplified. They really don't know the challenges and the issues. And they walk away from those discussions shaking their head saying, these people are ignorant. These people are foolish. These people are they're just bigots. They're just prejudiced, arrogant, ignorant people. And they walk away turned off to Christianity, turned off to any kind of conservatism, not because they're evil, but because the Christians have set such a bad example in their discussions, in their conversation, in their behavior, and so on, that these opponents have reason to believe that the Christians don't represent truth or goodness or any kind of virtue at all. And, that's to the shame of those Christians. And I think those Christians are going to give an account to God for their failure to faithfully represent Christ's teaching and way of life. Now, one of the reasons why I think some Christians get accused of being liberal is not because they actually are liberal, as I'm not liberal, but I'm accused of being liberal, simply because I'm comfortable talking about liberal ideas. And if we consider what's called the far left, the extreme liberal views, and the far right and the extreme conservative views, most of the people I know who are Christians are, identify as these far right Christians, pro-life movement, maybe even like traditional Catholic, whatever, Catholics for Trump kind of people. The majority of the people that I talk to as Christians, that's where they're at, politically, religiously, and so on. They're much further to the right than I am. I'm comfortable further to the left. I'm comfortable with what I think are more liberal positions. And by liberal, I mean not so, like Pope Francis says, not so rigid, not so restrictive, not so exclusive. But I would go further than that and say not so timid, not so fearful, not so worried, not so threatened. I don't feel threatened by these discussions. I don't feel intimidated by these discussions. And I think part of the reason is because I look back to my own conversion and I see that it just took time, that the seeds of truth were already in me years and years before I started acting on them, because it just took time. It took time for me to really understand them. It took time for me to get my life in order and sort of fix piece by piece and address problems one by one. I wanted to amend my life, but I didn't understand how, because I was living in that life. It took time for me to learn what needed to be fixed, to understand what the causes of my problems were. And that's going to be true for anyone. It's going to take time. And if we're sincere in our discussions, if we're sincere in evangelization, we need to be calm and patient, because these things take time. Even if someone is eager to convert, it takes time. There are different circumstances we all have. Some people are entangled in all kinds of pre-existing, business activities or relationships and things like that, and they need to untangle themselves. And sometimes it takes time. And so when I talk to a person, I never think of it as an attempt to convert someone. And I think this is what Pope Francis is constantly talking about when he warns against speaking to others with the spirit of proselytizing, thinking that there's going to be like some great debate and then people are going to immediately become believers. And, there are reasons why Christians think like that. For example, we read in the book of Acts, and it says, St. Peter spoke at Pentecost to the crowd, and 3,000 people were converted when St. Peter spoke. And so we read about these things. We read about St. Paul going through a town and there being, this massive wave of conversions, and all these people are added to the church. And we read those stories and we imagine that that's how it works. But we don't read those stories and keep the context in mind. We don't keep all the details in mind. Let's remember that those Jews, for example, who converted at St. Peter's preaching, many of them were already present and familiar with the life and teachings of Jesus. Many of them likely saw or heard about the miracles that he did. And they also were speaking after the resurrection. So there's a lot more to that event than just Peter's message that day. Those people also witnessed the miracle of the apostles speaking in tongues at Pentecost. So there were miracles involved, there was a past history involved, and it was, because of this unique historical moment at Pentecost, which was a one-time event, that there was this massive conversion. It wasn't Peter talking to a crowd, like me talking to a group of people. It wasn't simply a conversation or an argument. It wasn't a debate. It was a much deeper, broader, much more radical event than just a lecture being given or a homily being given. And then with St. Paul again, St. Paul was not just a guy who went around arguing with people. St. Paul was a miracle worker. When he went and preached, he also performed miracles. So there's a lot more to these stories and to these scenes than just somebody having an argument and people believing. People weren't converted by arguments. There was a lot more going on than the preaching. What we've got to respect is the fact that what we think and discuss privately within our own souls, I like to say when we're laying in bed by ourselves, we're very different people than who we are in public, in front of a crowd, surrounded by our peers. There's a lot going on in our minds that we don't talk about publicly. That's private. There's a lot of things that we'd like to do that we don't tell other people about. Like I said, when I was in the process of converting, my parents didn't know anything about this. My friends didn't know anything about this. It was in my own privacy. It was in my own private hours, in my own room, alone, at my desk, thinking, reading, when I was driving, when I was exercising, when I was working. All of these things were brewing, and nobody knew about them. I never talked about them. I was still living a worldly life, still going out, still hanging out with friends, still goofing around, still being stupid and immature. But at the same time, these things were there. These things were developing, and I was thinking, but I didn't know what to do. And it all took time to develop. So when I speak to people, I understand that even if they disagree with me, even if they reject everything that I have to say, even if they call me names or whatever else, unjustly, not because I deserve to be called names, but by simply talking with them, telling them what I know to be true, explaining to them the reasons why I think it to be true, reasons that I think prove it to be true, I know there's going to be a public response, and I ignore that because the public response is not necessarily their true thoughts, not what they really think and feel. I understand why people respond publicly, with a lot of self-defense, with a lot of emotion, and they try to look good in front of their friends and buddies. I understand that. That's reasonable. I did the same thing. What I concern myself with is talking to them in a way that I believe they'll think about in private. And I'm willing to keep the conversation going for months and months, even years, if I have to. And I'm willing to keep working on it one step at a time, answering one question at a time, unraveling one knot at a time, because I know that's how it worked in my own life. That's how it worked in my life. I can remember the sources. I can remember the books that I consulted, the people I talked to, the sources where I found answers to my questions, and so on. I can remember how it just continued, step by step, piece by piece, day by day, while I still had to do other stuff. I had other stuff going on. I was in school, I was working, all these other things going on, and I was working on these spiritual things behind the scenes, piece by piece, question by question, problem by problem, topic by topic. And it took years. It took years. And so, knowing that I was able, by God's grace, to come out of really like the depths of secular culture, I don't see secular culture as anything to be afraid of, because if God's grace is in us, not that we should enter into it after we've received grace, which makes no sense, but when people are in it and they have not yet received God's grace, I think we need to realize that they're not necessarily in it by choice. They may not even they may not even want to be in it, but they may not have the strength to climb out of it. They may not have the courage to climb out of it. They may not understand what the Christian life would even look like. They may not know what to do. It's one thing to say that's bad. It's a very different thing to say that's good. And so there's a lot more to conversion than just having an argument and having someone, suddenly flip and just change their life overnight. It really doesn't work that way. That's not how conversion works. Conversion isn't something that we do to people. Conversion is something that people choose to do by cooperating with God's grace, and it takes a long time because it's eternal life. It's a man or a woman realizing the end for which he was created and exists, and it's a major event. It's the greatest event of this life, the greatest thing that can happen, and you've got a million different forces trying to prevent it and discourage it, including the person's own human weakness and concupiscence or inclination to sin, and it just takes time. It just takes time, and that's why calling someone a libtard or a liberal or whatever else only reveals that we don't understand how things work. Now, one of the reasons why I get concerned with this is because I see Catholics who were raised Catholic, born Catholic, went to Catholic schools, went to Catholic colleges, and they often imagine that they've seen everything. They often imagine that they have heard everything, know everything that's to be known, and they're very, very ignorant in the life and culture of other people. They're ignorant of other religions. They're ignorant of other lifestyles. For example, I grew up in an unbelieving family. Most cradle Catholic people couldn't even understand what that's like, what it's like to never pray, to never go to church, to have no religion in the house ever. It's hard for them to even understand what that's like and how a religious spirit develops and how it's built and cultivated. And just by watching them talk, I can see that they don't understand the people that they're talking to, or people who are immersed in sexual relationships and immorality. They're spoken of and spoken to as if they are hungering and thirsting for evil because they know and hate God and reject it. There's an assumption about sinful people that's a false assumption, and the assumption is that they understand what they're doing. The assumption is that they understand and they're doing it with understanding. And that's a false assumption. Think about when Jesus was crucified and he prayed on the cross and said, "Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing." It's that awareness that people who are living in sin are deceived. They're deceived by the devil. They're deceived by many people. They're seduced by people. They're tricked by people. They're lied to by people. They're abused by other people. They're deceived by their own minds and their own flesh, which is corrupt. And they're deceived by the devil himself and evil spirits. They're not choosing with understanding and full intent of the will to do the things that they're doing, and assuming that of them actually causes us to misunderstand them. And this is important because when we think that someone else understands what they're doing and they're doing it on purpose, it prevents us from having mercy. It prevents us from being merciful because we think they're doing it intentionally. And so we think, they deserve what they get. They deserve to be punished. They deserve to suffer because they are choosing to do evil. And it's really not true that that's what's happening in their lives. It's not true. And so we don't look at them as weak people who are deserving of mercy and help and instruction and support and friendship. We don't look at them like that. We look at them as these intentionally evil people who deserve to go to hell. And that false assumption that they all understand, like I said, it's contradicted by Christ's prayer on the cross, which should be the last argument you need to hear to get rid of that assumption. We should assume rather that the reason why people are in sin is because they don't understand and they're weak. They don't have the sacraments. They don't have the graces. They don't have the support or help that they need to resist temptation and to practice virtue. These things aren't easy. And we need to look at them as being weak like us, but weaker than us because we simply have access to grace and to help and support and encouragement that they don't necessarily have. And we have to actually reach out to them and offer to provide that help and instruction and support and friendship and encouragement. That's what evangelization is. It's going into the world to help the lost. Jesus Christ coming into the world from heaven to seek and save the lost. That's the work of evangelization. So when we see these political discussions, it drives me crazy because we'll see Christian people talking to and about unbelievers with no mercy, no sense of pity for their condition, no sense that the Christians are actually supposed to be their helpers, their teachers. Christians are supposed to be the light of the world. They're supposed to be the ones who actually show others the way and help them out of the deceptions, out of the weakness, and so on, to introduce them to the sacraments and lead them to reconciliation with God. That's actually our mission in the world. And so when you look at these conversations and you look at how Christian people talk to unbelievers, you just see that the Christian people don't understand. It's like in the Gospels when, who was it, James and John at one point said, "Would you like us to call down lightning from heaven to strike them?" As if God had called these men to follow Jesus so that they could carry out the judgment on unbelievers. And what does Jesus say to those men? He says, "You don't know what spirit you are of. You don't understand the Christian life. You don't understand what you're talking about. We're not here to condemn people and carry out God's justice. We're here to preach the gospel and to help people to be reconciled to God and to enter into the grace of the sacramental life that Jesus established for us by his own suffering, by his doing what we need to do for others. And so these political discussions just reveal the ignorance and really, I think, the spiritual trouble that many who identify as Christians are in because they don't understand the Christian spirit. They don't understand the Christian mission. They don't understand the disposition that Christians should have, the way that Christians should look at unbelievers, the way that Christians should speak to sinners and people who are lost in the world. They don't understand the grace of the gospel and the way of salvation and our role in the salvation of other people. And we can see that in these political talks. We see that with the spirit of Donald Trump. We see that in the spirit of the MAGA crowd, where they're calling names and criticizing and mocking and scoffing at unbelievers and people who don't practice the Christian faith, rather than looking at them with mercy and with pity and seeing ourselves as the people who are supposed to be helping them, not fighting against them, not mocking them, but helping them. We just see how wrong this political discussion really is. And that's why if you put the things that Pope Francis says and bishops say and many priests say, if you put them into the context of this situation, you'll understand why they say we shouldn't be proselytizing. We shouldn't be trying to convert people, because it just doesn't work like that. It takes time. We should be trying to, first and most importantly, we should be trying to become, examples of the Christian faith, to teach by our example, to have others be able to look at us and say, that guy has a peaceful life. That guy has a life that seems to be free from the problems that I have, a person that I can ask for advice and trust, that he'll be honest, that he's not, motivated by some other desire for gain or an advantage or anything like that, but he'll talk to me honestly and truthfully and be patient and help me. We should be seeking to study and practice the faith and cultivate that spirit of wisdom and patience and virtue. That's our first concern. Secondly, we should be, when we look at unbelievers and talk to unbelievers, we should not feel that they are, something other than we are. We should understand that they're everything we are, and that we would be everything they are, except that God's grace has helped us out of that. And their solution is very simple. It's the same as ours. They simply need God's grace. And so we should be praying for them that God would give them that grace to get started. It's called prevenient grace, the grace that sort of, jumpstarts a person's soul and gets them even thinking about religion, thinking about God, thinking about spiritual things, and then that God would give them his grace to convert and to be converted. And it doesn't happen at once. It's a lifelong process of gradual sanctification. We should be seeking to lead them into that grace. We have to be careful how we talk to them. We should make it clear to them that we're not different from them in any way as human beings, but it's the grace of God that allows us to do things. It's the knowledge of God. It's the faith that God gives us that causes us to believe. It's the hope that God gives us to overcome the difficulties of this life and to be confident that we're going to have eternal life and be rewarded for the good we do, even if it doesn't produce much fruit or bear many happy results in this life. God is going to reward us in heaven. And then the charity that allows us to do good for others when they don't deserve it, and really to even think about doing good to others rather than just seeking our own thing. that faith, hope, and charity, that grace, we've received that grace. That's why we're different. If we're different, it's because of grace. It's not because we're smart, not because we're patriots, not because we're strong. It's because God has given us grace. And if we don't understand that, and we don't communicate that, and we don't talk like that, we're in trouble spiritually. And we should explain it to them that you don't need to climb out of this hole by yourself. You don't need to change your life by yourself. You don't need to change your life in 5 minutes or you're lost. God is merciful. God is patient. And so long as you desire to turn to him and be saved, God will help you. That's the key. God is not a judge who commands us to pull ourselves, out of the pit, by our own strength. He is the Savior. He wants to save us, but he leaves it to us to will it. And we simply have to will it. And the way we manifest our will is by praying, not by climbing out of the hole, but by praying, by asking God to help us. And that's step one. The goal of that interaction is to eventually lead them into the church, to lead them to baptism, to lead them into the sacramental life. So if what you're doing is not interested in leading people into the sacramental life, well, then you're not evangelizing your neighbor. And you can think and say, well, that'd be much more, yeah, that's right, it's much more complicated. It's like a permanent relationship. And you can say, well, I don't really want to be, well, yeah, that's the problem. That's the problem. I don't think Jesus really wanted to be friends with the people he was friends with either, but he did so because he was moved by charity to help them out of their sin, out of their ignorance, so that they could have eternal life. And he did it, he was motivated to do it by his love for his Father, by his desire to lead people to his Father so that his Father would be glorified. And that's what should motivate us. So just the discussion, the spirit of the discussion, the language of the discussion, we can just see that Christianity isn't in those discussions. And if we're going to become evangelistic, if we're going to be faithful to the gospel, we're going to manifest that by preaching grace and forgiveness and being merciful and patient and gentle. And we can just see that those are the real strengths of the Christian life. Those are the strengths. And what we're seeing is that Christians don't manifest those strengths. Christians are as emotional, as easily triggered, as easily angered, as easily provoked. Even, what's even amazing to me is that Christians are, they don't even control their language. They're foul-mouthed and angry and disrespectful and mocking. The opposite of everything that the Christian spirit should be. And these unbelievers, they see it. They see that. And what it causes them to think is that these people aren't really serious about this message. They're just trying to control us. They're trying to make us do what they want us to do because they don't even practice it themselves. They're just trying to control us. They're trying to make us do their will. And that leads them to resist and fight even more because they see that the message isn't even sincere. It's not even to be respected. And that wasn't true of the apostles or the saints. People knew the apostles and the saints were sincere, and they trusted them. And the people who we call liberals don't trust the conservatives as people. They don't trust them. They don't think they're sincere. They don't think that they're honest. They think that they just say one thing for political reasons, and then personally they do the opposite. And in many cases, they're right about that. But we have to consider whether our disposition and the way that we talk to unbelievers is like Christ's way, And if it's not, what are we even doing? What are we doing? We're so wrapped up in this crazy political enthusiasm, this party spirit in American politics, that we don't even seem to be asking whether or not we're acting and talking to people as Christ did. And it's no surprise that there's not a whole lot of people interested in converting to the faith these days. There's nothing to fear in the lives of unbelievers. Their lives are unhappy. We're only happy in God. Anyone who's not following God's will, anyone who's not living within the Catholic Church, a life that's obedient, that's seeking to be pure and holy and virtuous, anyone who's not living that life, they can be dancing in the clubs or laughing as they drink their beer and eat their food and fool around in their immorality. But you're just seeing the show. You're seeing the smoke and mirrors. You know, when I was a kid, my dad used to listen to Motown music. And I remember there was one song by a singer named Smokey Robinson that was The Tears of a Clown. The Tears of a Clown. It was saying about, I could probably remember the words. Let me think. People say I'm the life of the party because I tell a joke or two. But though I might be laughing, loud and hearty, deep inside I'm blue. So take a good look at my face. If you look closely, it's easy to trace the tracks of my tears. Last time I heard that song, I was probably 14 years old. But if you think about the words of that song, though I might be laughing loud and hearty, deep inside I'm blue. That's the real condition. That's secular music. That's the real condition that our neighbors are in. And you can't allow the outside show, you can't allow the tears of the clown, or I should say the laughing of the clown. You shouldn't allow the clown show to distract you from the reality that these people are unhappy, these people are hurting, these people are lost and miserable, and they're going to go from misery to misery unless they're helped out of that path through the gospel. So don't react to the clown show, don't react to the scoffing, don't react to the arrogant responses, don't react to the mockery, don't react to the nastiness and the cursing or anything else. Realize that people who are not walking in the way of Christ, they're unhappy. They're unhappy. Deep inside, when they're alone, they're unhappy. And what we see Christians doing today, which is stupid, is we see Christians reacting to the outward appearance, Christians reacting to their words, Christians reacting to their nasty responses. And the Christians are proving that they themselves don't understand the truth of what's going on. But anyway, in this left versus right political environment, we have to act like Christians. We can't just do what Donald Trump is doing. We can't do what some loudmouth right-wing political talk show host is doing or saying, what Tucker Carlson is saying and how he acts and how he talks about people or anyone else. That's not the Christian message. That's not evangelization. And like I said, I believe that the truth is further to the left than the political right. I think this is why people who are committed to that right-wing political message, it's why they get upset with things that the Pope says and what the bishops say. They accuse the Pope and bishops of being liberals, which is just stupid. It's stupid. The Pope and bishops are not liberals. They're simply not right-wing, MAGA Republicans, because that's not the Christian position. The Christian position is further left than that, but that doesn't make you a member of the far left, liberal, miserable modern culture. And there are other issues, understanding what evangelization is, understanding what people who are not Christians are actually thinking and doing, and what they actually need to help them from us. It's going to push us further to the left, in more of a, I wouldn't say a middle place, but more of an independent, moderate place, where we're able to maintain the morality of the Christian life in our own life, strengthened by God's grace, pursuing perfection privately as Christians, but understanding that that's not possible for unbelievers. They have to even become Christians first. And so there's no contradicting in saying, I need to pursue this standard of morality, but I can't expect that from my neighbor, because what allows me to pursue that standard is a life of grace, rooted in the scriptures, in the tradition of the church, in the grace of the sacraments, in the support of the Christian community, and so on. I am able to pursue these things, but my neighbors are not able to pursue these things, and they won't be able to unless they enter into this community themselves. And that's my concern. So it's not contradictory to say, hey, we Christians have to do better. We have to maintain high standards. We have to be seeking the way of perfection as far as we're able. But we're not to impose those standards on unbelievers, because those standards can only be sought with the grace of the gospel. And these people haven't even yet been introduced or initiated to the life of the gospel. And so we need to look at them with mercy, be patient, not judge, and so on. And maintaining that balance is the opposite of a life of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is where you hold others to higher standards than yourself. Most people yelling at people on the left are hypocrites. If we flip hypocrisy upside down and say, hold yourself to high standards and be merciful to others, that's the Christian spirit. That's the Christian life. It's the opposite of hypocrisy. And we don't see that in modern Christian conversation. So, as I said, if you're sensitive to the fact that you were once an unbeliever, lost in the world without God, and the grace of God led you out of that, and that there's nothing in that life to fear that grace isn't able to overcome, you shouldn't be intimidated or, short-tempered or angry with people who are struggling with sinful lives. You should understand perfectly what they're going through, and you should understand perfectly what they need. And it's not simply to be argued with. It's not to be called names. It's not to be labeled. It's not to be laughed at. They have to enter into the grace that you entered into and that you remain in. And if they do enter into that grace, they will be able to change their lives. And that changing of their lives may take the rest of their lives. It may not happen overnight or even in a year or two. It may take 30 years to be converted. That's just how it works. It's how it works in your life, isn't it? That's how it works in my life. I'm still being converted. I've been a Christian for almost 30 years now. I'm still being converted. Well, the same is going to be true for them. And so we have to make sure we understand the gospel. We understand the means of preaching the gospel. And we have to understand that we take in our minds the idea of the hypocritical life and flip it upside down, because that's true Christianity. Placing the burden and the high standards on ourselves and being merciful and patient towards unbelievers, knowing that they can't do these things. They don't have the strength to do these things. They don't even understand them. And it's our job. We're the light of the world. It's our job to teach them and help them. So let's get this party spirit, this arrogant political arguing. We have to get this out of our system and stop acting like this, because we're not doing the work of Christians in this modern culture. It's very easy to slide into that big mouth, arrogant, mocking spirit, but that's not a Christian spirit. It's much further to the left than that, much more patient, much more merciful, much more compassionate. And if we get that right, we'll make a difference. I hope that helps. God bless.